17. Amalek. For centuries, Assyria was scarcely known to many historians, who discounted the biblical narrative and questioned whether so great an empire existed. The same neglect has even longer prevailed with respect to Amalek. In very ancient times, the first of the nations, Numbers chapter 24, verse 20. Its origin is misunderstood even by biblical scholars, who derive it from Esau's grandson Amalek, Genesis chapter 36, verses 12 and 16. But long before this Amalek's birth, the nation Amalek existed. Genesis chapter 14, verse 7. Amalek is identified with some interesting evidence, with Hyksos by Velikovsky. This identification certainly dovetails with the narrative of Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 to 16. The importance of Amalek to biblical law has reference to a judgment pronounced by God against it, with God's covenant people being entrusted with its execution. Since a degree of judgment is an aspect of law, it must be considered in any discussion of law, especially when it is included in the legal code. After Israel left Egypt, Amalek met and attacked them. Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 to 16. Two passages describe the encounter in terms of God's sentence. And the Lord said unto Moses, Write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. For I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar, and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi. For, he said, Because the Lord hath sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Exodus chapter 17, verses 14 to 16. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when you were come forth out of Egypt, how he met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary, and he feared not God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord thy God hath given thee rest from all thine enemies round about, in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it, that thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, thou shalt not forget it. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 17 to 19. This passage states several things. First, in some sense, Amalek was at war against God. The psalmist later cited Amalek as one of the conspiring nations. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. Psalm 83, verses 5 and 7. Samuel declared to Saul, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way, when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 2 and 3. In 1 Samuel chapter 28, verse 18, reference is made to God's fierce wrath upon Amalek. As the foregoing verses make clear, second, God was also at war against Amalek. Third, Israel had been attacked by Amalek and been savagely treated. Fourth, Israel was required to wage war unto death against Amalek. This war, fifth, was to continue from generation to generation, and the remembrance of Amalek was to be blotted out. To examine these points more carefully, first, what was the offense of Amalek against God? The Hebrew of Exodus chapter 17 verse 16 can be read, "Because the hand of Amalek is upon or against the throne of heaven, therefore the Lord will have war." Certainly, God's enmity towards Amalek indicates that in some sense, Amalek's hand was raised against God. Hence, Moses' arms had to be raised to God to indicate Israel's dependence on God. The seriousness of Amalek's offense is reflected in the Talmud. Thus, Rabbi Hosea taught, 3 commandments were given to Israel when they entered the land. 1. To appoint a king. 2. To cut off the seed of Amalek. 3. And to build themselves the chosen house, that is, the temple. And I do not know which of them had priority. The Talmud showed awareness of the humanistic horror concerning God's judgment on Amalek, and ascribed this horror to Saul in one of its legends. When the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Saul, "Now go and smite Amalek," he said. If on account of one person the Torah said, "Perform the ceremony of the red heifer, whose neck is to be broken," how much more ought consideration to be given to all these persons? And if human beings sinned, what has the cattle committed? And if the adults have sinned, what have the little ones done? A divine voice came forth and said, "Be not righteous over much." Rawlinson pointed out, with reference to Exodus chapter 17 verse 16, Amalek, by attacking Israel, had lifted up his hand against the throne of God, therefore would God war against him from generation to generation. An old tradition specifies the nature of Amalek's warfare against God and Israel. Midrashic lore reveals how the Amalekites made themselves particularly hateful by cutting off the circumcised members of the Israelites, both prisoners and corpses, tossing them into the air and shouting with obscene curses to Yahweh, "This is what you like, so take what you have chosen." This tradition is deduced from Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 18, "And cut off the tails of all your stragglers," alluding to Amalek's harassment of the Hebrews at Rephidim during the Exodus. The verb form, cut off the tail, can mean to castrate, or, used as a military image, as in Joshua chapter 10 verse 19, it's one usage other than Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 18, it can mean, as rendered in the King James, smote the hindmost, the stragglers. It may have this military usage in both cases, but the ancient tradition which cites castration as Amalek's act has perhaps truth behind it. It accounts for both the divine wrath against and the prophetic horror for Amalek. Blasphemy and perversity met in Amalek's cruel act. Amalek hated Israel because Amalek, above all else, hated God. Hence its radical perversity with respect to Israel. This perversity continued into Esther's day in the attempt of Haman to destroy all the Jews. Esther chapter 3. Second, God was at war with Amalek, and this warfare is to be continued from generation to generation. Exodus chapter 17 verse 6. Note the distinction. Israel's war against Amalek is to continue until Amalek and its remembrance is blotted out. And Amalek as an empire is today indeed forgotten, but God's war is from generation to generation. It is not presuming upon the text, but in conformity with biblical typology, to recognize here a declaration of God's continuing warfare from generation to generation with the Amalekites of every age, race, and nation. Perverse violence, contempt for God and for man, has commonly marked fallen man. Consider, for example, the report of Maurice or Davy. In Africa, war captives are often tortured, killed, or allowed to starve to death. Among the Tshi-speaking peoples, prisoners of war are treated with shocking barbarity. Men, women, and children, mothers with infants on their backs and little children scarcely able to walk, are stripped and secured together with cords around the neck in gangs of 10 or 15. Each prisoner being additionally secured by having the hands fixed to a heavy block of wood, which has to be carried in the head. Thus hampered and so insufficiently fed that they are reduced to mere skeletons, they're driven after the victorious army for month after month, their brutal guards treating them with the greatest cruelty, while, should their captors suffer a reverse, they are at once indiscriminately slaughtered to prevent recapture. Ramsayer and Kuhn mention the case of a prisoner, a native of Accra, who was kept in a log, that is, secured to the felled trunk of a tree by an iron staple driven over the wrist, with insufficient food for 4 months, and who died under this ill treatment. Another time they saw amongst some prisoners a poor, weak child, who, when angrily ordered to stand upright, painfully drew himself upright, showing the sunken frame in which every bone was visible. Most of the prisoners seen on this occasion were mere living skeletons. One boy was so reduced by starvation that his neck was unable to support the weight of his head, which, if he sat, drooped almost to his knees. Another, equally emaciated, coughed as if at the last gasp, while a young child was so weak from want of food as to be unable to stand. The Ashantis were much surprised that the missionaries should exhibit any emotion at such spectacles, and on one occasion, when they went to give food to some starving children, the guards angrily drove them back. But the regular army and the levies in Dahomey show an equal callousness to human suffering. Wounded prisoners are denied all assistance, and all prisoners who are not destined to slavery are kept in a condition of semi-starvation that speedily reduces them to mere skeletons. The lower jawbone is much prized as a trophy, and it is very frequently torn from the wounded and living foe. The scenes that followed the sack of the fortress in Fiji are too horrible to be described in detail. That neither age nor sex were spared was the last atrocious feature. Nameless mutilations inflicted sometimes on living victims, deeds of mingled cruelty and lust, made self-destruction preferable to capture. With the fatalism that underlies the Melanesian character, many would not attempt to run away, but would bow their heads passively to the club stroke. If any were miserable enough to be taken alive, their fate was awful indeed. Carried back bound to the main village, they were given up to young boys of rank to practice their ingenuity in torture, or stunned by a blow, they were laid in heated ovens, and when the heat brought them back to consciousness of pain, their frantic struggles would convulse the spectators with laughter. Usually, such matters are treated as evidence of primitivism, as evolutionary survivals in man, rather than as evidence of his fallen nature. Civilized man, no less than tribes of Africa and Melanesia, is given to perverse violence, to cruelty, and a delight in cruelty. The communist terror far surpasses the tribal terror in perversity, violence, and scope. The evidence is here all too extensive. The use of terror is a routine political fact in the modern world of humanism. Men are killed ostensibly to save man and society, and the universal love of mankind is proclaimed with total hatred. Man exercises perverse violence as a means of asserting omnipotence. To be as God, this is man's sin. Genesis chapter 3 verse 5. And yet man cannot exercise omnipotence or power to create a new world or a new man. Man turns, therefore, to destruction as a means of asserting his claim to omnipotence. As O'Brien in 1984 declared, "We shall squeeze you empty, and then we shall fill you ourselves." As Orwell had O'Brien say in a famous passage, "Power is in inflicting pain and humiliation. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing." Do you begin to see, then, what kind of world we are creating? It is the exact opposite of the stupid hedonistic utopias that the old reformers imagined. A world of fear and treachery and torment. A world of trampling and being trampled upon. A world which will grow not less but more merciless as it refines itself. Progress in our world will be progress toward more pain. The old civilizations claimed that they were founded on love and justice. Ours is founded upon hatred. In our world, there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. Everything else we shall destroy, everything. Already we're breaking down the habits of thoughts which have survived from before the revolution. We have cut the links between child and parent, and between man, and between man and woman. No one dares trust a wife or a child or a friend any longer. But in the future, there will be no wives and no friends. Children will be taken from their mothers at birth, as one takes eggs from a hen. The sex instinct will be eradicated. Procreation will be an annual formality, like the renewal of a ration card. We shall abolish the orgasm. Our neurologists are at work upon it now. There will be no loyalty, except loyalty toward the party. There will be no love, except the love of Big Brother. There will be no laughter, except the laugh of triumph over a defeated enemy. There will be no art, no literature, no science. When we are omnipotent, we shall have no more need of science. There will be no distinction between beauty and ugliness. There will be no curiosity, no employment of the process of life. All competing pleasures will be destroyed. But always, do not forget this, Winston, always there will be the intoxication of power, constantly increasing and constantly growing subtler. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on the enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Here, plainly stated, the sin of man comes to self-realization. In order to play at God, to gain the sensation of omnipotence, total terror and total destruction, affected with full perversity, are man's way of godhood. But this perverse violence, a pseudo-omnipotence, brings forth God's wrath, so that, from generation to generation, God's enmity to every Amalekite remains. As surely as the first Amalek was blotted out, and in Haman, the last of the known Amalekites, so the Amaleks and Amalekites of today are under judgment and to be obliterated. Note the destiny of Haman. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Esther chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. Third, Israel was attacked by Amalek. According to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 18, Amalek feared not God. Amalek's attack on Israel, according to the Midrashic lore, was an obscene defiance of God and a contempt for God. Where men attack God's people, there we often have a covert or overt attack on God. Unable to strike directly at God, they strike at God's people. There is thus continual warfare between Amalek and Israel, between God's people and God's enemies. The outcome must be the blotting out of God's enemies. Thus, fourth, the covenant people must wage war against the enemies of God, because this war is unto death. The deliberate, refined, and obscene violence of the anti-God forces permits no quarter. Fifth, this warfare must continue until the Amalekites of the world are blotted out, until God's law order prevails and His justice reigns. Because God's omnipotence is total, the pseudo-omnipotence of man, the would-be God, is also total in its vain imaginations. This pseudo-omnipotence becomes progressively more and more violent, more and more perverse. It does not mellow. Its goal is a manifestation of sheer power, and because it cannot manifest power to regenerate, it manifests power to destroy. The typology of Moses' upraised hands, Exodus chapter 17, verses 11 and 12, tell us of the means whereby Amalek is to be destroyed, with a full-scale offensive on all fronts, but always with a full reliance on the Lord, who is the only ground of victory.